Hello, animal allies. What's up? What's good? What's new? What's shaken? Thank you for joining us. I am very excited tonight to be joined by filmmaker Mark DeVries.
Hello, animal allies.
Oops.
What's up?
Did that again.
What's good? What's new? What's shaken? Thank you for joining us.
Okay, how do I?
I am very excited tonight to be joined by filmmaker Mark DeVries. Animal
Oh my
allies.
God, I can't believe I did this again.
What's up?
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, everybody. I was trying to exit out of YouTube in another window, and obviously I couldn't find it. Okay, let's try that again. Hello, animal allies. What's up? What's new? What's good? I'm very excited to be joined by filmmaker Mark DeVries, director and producer of Humans and Other Animals. But before we start our program, my name is Michelle Granberg. I'm a mentor and team member with Animal Activism Mentorship. For those of you who are new to AAM, AAM is a multinational program designed to support and empower activists to reach their potential and equip them with the tools, community, and resources they need to boldly participate in our global animal liberation movement. Founded in 2020, AAM offers a free 3-month mentorship program which pairs experienced activists with aspiring activists. You can apply today to become a mentor or mentee through our website. And we are so much more than a mentorship program. We offer free educational online live streams and trainings like this one. We have a podcast called the Animal Liberation Hour, and we host large-scale in-person activism events around the country, like our Austin Convergence, 11 Days of Activism, October 11th through 21st in Texas. And we will put that link in the chat. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest. Mark DeVries directed the award-winning documentary Speciesism, the movie, which was featured on Amazon Prime and remains widely used as an introduction to animal ethics. He additionally pioneered the use of aerial drones to investigate environmental issues and continues such work with Mercy for Animals. He's also an attorney licensed to practice law in Washington, D.C. His newest documentary is streaming now on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, and Google Play. The globally acclaimed documentary Humans and Other Animals takes you on an epic journey from cutting-edge science to high-stakes spying that forever changes how you see animals, including yourself. Humans and Other Animals takes on in the most comprehensive and engaging manner yet put to film what may soon be a defining issue of our time. So Mark will take questions shortly, but hold them for now. So, all right, Mark, you can unmute. Hey, Mark, welcome. Please.
Thanks for having me. Great to talk to you.
So please introduce yourself and give us an overview of the documentary. Then we'll dive into it more deeply.
So the aim of this documentary is in large part to provide animal advocates with a comprehensive piece that introduces the case for non-human animals' sentience, the philosophical case for taking non-human animals seriously, the issues of factory farming and animal exploitation, the practical steps that individuals can take, and the answers to all of the common questions and objections that people have. So it's meant to be a one-shot introduction to the animal movement that I hope will become a go-to introduction for animal advocates to share with friends and family members, to host as screenings, and so on. And part of the benefit of it is that it's not graphic. It gets the ideas across. It, I think, is powerful in terms of helping people empathize with animals on factory farms and used in different ways, but it does so without being bloody or gory. So it's not too upsetting to watch while still getting that across. And at the hook of the film, when sharing it with people, is the fascinating inner lives of non-human animals, that we're really at a scientific revolution in which we're learning that other animals are so much more similar to us than we ever imagined, that it's changing how we view them, and by extension, changing how we view ourselves. And having a film like that allows people to have something that they can give and show friends and family members and colleagues. And before I forget, you can access the film through the film's website, humansandotheraниmalsmovie.com.
Nice, really nice. And some folks are already commenting in the chat that they've seen the film and that they really love it. So we would love to hear more of your praise for Mark and his film in a little while. So we want to dive a little bit further into the making of it, the purpose of it, the vision of it, as well as the content. You know, I was telling you that I've watched it almost 4 times, and each time got something so new out of it, and I was moved more profoundly every time that I watched it. And it's just hit me on so many different levels. And I really mean that. So thank you for that. So given that, Mark, it takes years. I know, was it 5 years? I think you said, I think I read, or you said
I did it
you completed
on and
on and
off for
off
a
for
period
5
of about 5 years. Yeah.
But that's a huge commitment. So given that you knew that was the commitment because you've done another documentary before, what was your inspiration that made you think, okay, it's time again, and this is what's next for me. This is the topic. Was it a sort of a natural segue from speciesism, the documentary you did you conceptualize humans and other animals soon after completing speciesism, or was it sort of a gap between and
I
separate from
actually
that?
did conceptualize it um, sort of near, like soon after speciesism came out. And I realized I wasn't sure, though, if it would be the best thing to do at the time. And as time went by, it seemed clear that it would be beneficial to have something that does a lot of the same things that my first film, Speciesism, did, but does it in a way that is higher quality in terms of the production, that is non-graphic. Speciesism isn't really graphic, but it moves a little bit more in that direction, and that is easier to follow for newcomers and is more engaging at the outset. There were a lot of lessons I learned from Speciesism. You know, I'm very glad that it had the impact that it did, and it got a very large audience around the world, and people still use the film. But there was a lot of room for improvement in making what, you know, I was hoping to be sort of the optimal introduction to the movement in film form. So there was room for going further than I did, and doing it better.
Nice. I love that. It's almost like you envision it like a primer, like a curriculum. Or maybe it just unfolded that way as a curriculum and you didn't realize you're going to have 1.0, 2.0 and keep building on that. Of course, that sort of naturally occurs. But just to backtrack then, as you're not that you're the expert on speciesism, but just in case, even though I think we're preaching to the choir here with our audience, but just define speciesism anyway, in your words, I'd like to hear it.
Sure. Before I forget, what you mentioned about the idea of it being sort of a curriculum, in part, I would actually think that this is the film to watch first. This is sort of the better dipping your toe into the water. And so in a way, I sort of thought of this film as a prequel. And Speciesism sort of is the a little bit deeper into it. So this is definitely, I think, the right start, if you haven't seen either one of them, to start with humans and other animals. But the definition of speciesism is an attitude of prejudice or bias against some species and in favor of other species that result in us taking the interests of some species more seriously than the interests of other species. And usually this is understood in the context of humans versus all other animals. So in that case, it's a prejudice or bias in favor of humans and against non-human animals, by which we take the interests or the well-being of humans more seriously. And it seems to have a lot of psychological characteristics that are similar to other forms of prejudices against groups of humans. Now, to step back and ask, well, is it a prejudice or is it just a justified type of discrimination? And the case for it being an unjustified attitude of bias is that the basic ethical principles that we hold among humans include that causing harm is bad, causing someone pain or suffering. And because non-human animals are capable of being harmed, they can experience pain and suffering, it seems like that basic ethical principle applies to them. They have characteristics that we already hold to be morally relevant among humans. And that's when the concept of speciesism kicks in, where we say, well, what would justify this distinction between humans and non-human animals, where we take the humans more seriously, the human suffering more seriously, the human pain more seriously, and the various things that most of us initially think of as the potential grounds for justifying that distinction. For example, that we're smarter, those different grounds don't hold up to scrutiny because there are many humans who lack the various characteristics that we think at the outset might distinguish humans and other animals. For example, babies don't have the cognitive abilities of adult humans, and non-human animals have lots of cognitive abilities greater than those of babies, as just one example. And so once we reflect on it, it becomes harder and harder to find clear grounds for being confident that we can make this sharp distinction between humans and other animals. And it's on that basis that philosophers and psychologists and others have argued that we have this unjustified prejudice called speciesism.
Yeah, thank you for expanding on that, because that helped me, even because I tend to explain it to people in much simpler terms, because it's hard for me to grasp all of those layers. And we think, when we think about our dogs and we say we love our dogs, but we'll eat cows, and why, right? What is the difference there, and how can we really judge based on those differences? And your entire documentary is really that it's just degrees of difference. We're more alike than we are different. So that debunks, the whole idea of there being a distinction. But I'm curious, so who coined the term speciesism? Do you know, or how long it's been used, or no, you don't know?
Yes, the person who coined the term speciesism actually appears in the film very briefly, Richard Ryder, a former Oxford clinical psychologist.
Right.
And yeah, he was just, it was, in the 1970s, and people were talking about racism and sexism. And one day it just occurred to him that speciesism follows in many ways the same pattern. And as you mentioned about dogs versus, cows and so on, that's an important other type of speciesism. It's not always about humans versus non-human animals. We also differentiate between animals, even animals that are really very similar to each other, like dogs and pigs, as is shown in the film.
And even within breeds, like within the dog breed, sometimes pit bulls will get discriminated against as well. So it exists on macro levels and micro levels, certainly. So, yeah, so we're going to kind of jump around a bit with my questions. I hope that's okay. But this is all great teasers for people who haven't watched the film to please watch it. Let's talk about the investigations. So part of a large chunk of the documentary is these investigations that you bring us in on. and see you behind the scenes, how you are investigating, meaning getting footage, either directly or covertly, from factory farms, basically. So my question is, are there any follow-up from that, or changes or results since you made the documentary? In other words, did your footage make an impact directly yet? And how did you plan out the investigations? And then I have to ask, were you scared or nervous?
Well, in terms of the impact, what I actually showed were standard legal practices. So it's not that I came across particularly egregious things relative to the standard practices, which of course are themselves egregious. But because of that, it's not a situation where, for example, that a farm would get prosecuted for animal cruelty or anything like that, because these are the standard practices. And a lot of people are quite shocked by that. A lot of people see standard practices in factory farming and they think they're an exception. In fact, some people think that factory farming itself is an exception. I realized years ago in speaking with a colleague of mine that a lot of people seem to think that when they hear the term factory farming and they hear about these animals in these huge sheds with thousands of individuals, that's this subset of farming. That's this sort of newfangled thing that's rare. But that's actually the majority of animals raised for food, the vast majority now, especially in places like the United States. So the animal movement as a whole is starting to chip away at that. On the one side, there are animal advocates working towards reforms at the corporate level and at the legislative level that are resulting in some of the first, over the past few decades, seemingly minor but significant when you multiply it by billions of individuals, changes that are causing them to suffer less in those factory farms, like at least having enough room to spread their wings, which when you multiply it by hundreds of millions, let's say, of individuals, is a lot less suffering. But then on the other hand, there are animal advocates who point out that there's some limit to how far that can go, because we're still all buying, and a large percentage of population buying these products from these factory farms and demanding that they be relatively cheap. So that's why many animal advocates focus on seeking to reduce the demand for animal products, promoting more plant-based eating and so on. And that seems to have an impact as well. There's a good case that economically, as is discussed in the film, individuals throughout their lifetimes, by not eating animals and not eating animal products, actually have a good chance of having a very significant impact on the number of animals in these factory farms. And that's something to be very happy and proud of, to know that you're contributing in that way, and to know that by persuading others, you're multiplying your impact in that way.
Nice. So you're contributing to, hopefully, the needle with what you're doing is another form of activism, and hopefully it will move the needle with awareness. All along the way, no matter what we're doing as activists, we're also spreading awareness, and that always makes a difference.
And I forgot your other question about, was I scared? Yes, it was at many points quite scary to, as you see in the film, even watching the film, people get scared. And so being there was quite something for a lot of these, having to, sneak into places or use these different types of robots and other equipment. I don't want to give away too much for people who haven't seen it yet, but using different types of techniques to get this footage and to be able to show the world what happens inside. That came with some real risks, and thankfully I came out of it okay.
Okay, good. you're here to tell the tale, so that's
Right,
good.
exactly.
For any budding investigators out there, it's worth the risk. Be careful though, of course. But let's talk more about that. Let's talk about the drones, because it's something that you're known for, something that where you're bringing technology to bear, technology, capitalizing on technology that exists to help the animals. Your use of drones was pretty incredible, as we see it in the documentary. How did you get started using the drones, or how did you figure out how to use them effectively? And I don't know, do you have any funny stories that happened with the drones where I don't know, I can only imagine that they can be unpredictable, sort of.
They certainly can be, especially early on. When I started using drones all the way back in 2012, um, they were the ones that were available to me were so difficult to use. They involved having to start them by plugging two cables into each other and having them create a spark, which was very unnerving, especially when I was like taking off from like dry grass and so forth. And they would just sometimes just randomly fly sideways and crash into a tree, and it was quite difficult to use. I went places where I was barely able to get the drone off the ground. I went all the way someplace, and then it just had all sorts of problems, one after another, magnetic interference or whatever. And then I finally, in North Carolina, filmed the first drone footage where I flew over a manure lagoon of a factory farm and the factory farm next to it. And for people who are not familiar, in these giant industrial pig farms, especially in North Carolina, they have thousands upon thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of pigs in these rows of buildings where there's nothing but concrete pens. There's a concrete flooring and metal sides of these pens. And the waste falls through slats in the concrete floors that they're forced to stand on day in and day out. And it's flushed into these giant open pits called manure lagoons. And they're essentially open air cesspools. And that waste, these can be millions of gallons. They can be the size of a football field or more. And the neighbors talk about, at various times when the wind is coming their way and then the waste is being flushed into the lagoons, just being overwhelmed with the stench of these millions of gallons of sewage, of untreated sewage pouring into this thing. And in some cases, they even spray it into the air on nearby fields, ostensibly as fertilizer, but a lot of times they're not even really seeming to grow anything on the fields. It's basically just to lower the levels in the and have it basically drain that way through going into the groundwater. So this is it's just an astonishing thing. It's a window, a really powerful window into what factory farming is really like now, what animal agriculture is really like now. And what animal agriculture is like is, by and large, industrial scale factories where things are entirely controlled for maximizing production, and the consequences to the animals, to the surrounding environment, to the health of people nearby. It's almost hard to believe until you see it for yourself, which is why I filmed it with those drones.
Oh my gosh, yeah, seeing it from up above, seeing the lagoons from up above, just it hits you how much space they take up and how gross that is, and how no one else can see it until you get to that heightened view. You can't see it from ground level. And that's just a glimpse. You're right. That reminds us that's just a glimpse. There's what else are we blind to and really not seeing? And in the footage that you show in terms of factory farming, and I like how you sort of segue to the factory farming after sort of talking a little bit more about the othering of animals. This is the result. This is the cost. This is the moral implication of our othering, making animals others and different, how extreme it's gotten. And I know you were deliberate about not being too graphic in what you've shown so that it's more palatable for most people, so more people will watch. But I will say I've seen footage, there's so much more footage out there, but I've seen mild footage and some of the worst footage, and still watching your footage in the film was very upsetting. It was upsetting what I saw, but knowing everything else that I know, it sort of
Right.
dragged into that. And when I saw the chickens and the pigs, especially in the truck, I don't want to give away too much either, but oh my God, the worst was seeing all those calf hutches. I
Yeah.
really
I
cried
think
when I saw that. So what was it like for you to personally almost bear witness and again, not be able to help?
I think, as you said, it could be upsetting and moving without being graphic or like difficult to watch like that. It can be something where what's upsetting is knowing what happens to the animals, and that makes it something that an animal advocate, especially who already knows what's happening to the animals, can not have to look away from. It's not that sort of thing like the really graphic investigative footage. And yet it gets across, I think, powerfully what's happening. It was quite, in all of the examples that you just provided, really, it is always difficult to think about how much suffering there is and how, in that particular instance, I can't do something to help those particular individuals, or at least I can't do something that wouldn't jeopardize my other work to help even more individuals. And what I remind myself in knowing that I can't help those individuals is that I already knew that this was taking place. The only difference is that now I've obtained footage of it that I'll be able to use to show the world and to help more individuals like that. So by reminding myself of that, I can, stay focused on that positive aspect, that what I'm seeing means this is what I'm able to bring to the world. I already knew it was happening, so it shouldn't be news to me. But it is something where what is news is the fact that I'm able to document it and now able to share it with more people.
Yeah. Stay focused on the long view that people will see this and that things will change that, down the roads. So let's go from there and sort of in the documentary moving back a little bit, because you cover a lot, which I thought was so fascinating, about the philosophical why, like the why we even got to where we are with animals, why we're here with animals being so exploited and oppressed, and of course the ethical, underpinnings of that, the cause and effect. So if I'm correct in sort of summarizing this, one of the main points of the documentary is that there is this invisible belief system that humans are blind to that says animals are different in ways that make it okay to use them and that they are here for us. So both of those, like it's okay to use them because they're different and they're here for us anyway, not with us. So can you say more and summarize that because it's so important?
Yes, those are two very important ideas. I think you're right. The first of what you mentioned there is that we have this notion that animals experience less than we do. And we think of ourselves as sort of the measure of all things. The old terms like higher and lower animals. Higher is essentially more similar to us, more or less. And so we think often that animals who are more different from us, like let's say aquatic animals, we imagine them to be less sentient, less intelligent, less aware of the world, less complex, less sophisticated, because we're measuring all of those things as us being the one that's the most, and anything that's less like that being less. And evolution, how it works, shows us that that's simply not the case, that all of these different animals evolved for their own ecological niches and evolved very sophisticated capacities that are sometimes very similar to us, sometimes different from us. But as far as we can establish, animals of all different types are sentient and for huge numbers capable of emotions and capable of thinking. And so, for example, fish, we think of them as having less experience because they don't, let's say, use their faces for gestures. They gesture in different ways. And so we assume that there's less going on internally rather than that we understand less. So that's the first thing, that we use ourselves as the measure of all things. But the second thing, which I think goes really deep and has deep historical origins, is this notion, as discussed in the film, of non-human animals existing for humans. And of course, when you reflect upon it, it doesn't really make sense to think that somehow they would exist for us. What would that even really mean, for someone to exist for someone else? But we have such a deeply ingrained narrative that non-human animals exist for us, and indeed that the world exists for us, this anthropocentrism, that we don't even notice that that's the framework that we're using. We say things like, well, what else would the animals be for if not for us? Even though, of course, the answer is themselves. So to the extent that we can even think in terms of something existing for a purpose at all. But so that's a really powerful thing to, once you step out of it, really allow you to see yourself and see non-human animals in a fundamentally different way. And that's one of the other things that I was seeking for this film to do differently from other films on related topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for spotlighting that and explaining that. Um, Again, just leave it to humans to need to feel superior and elite and all of that. And this is the effects of that. But you're right, these are the invisible, silent belief systems that run us without realizing it until we become aware of that. But so now I'm thinking about how much I love all the scenes. There's so many scenes. And by the way, you traveled to so many places that, like, I'm blown away by how much travel you did, and it all shows in the documentary. But to get the footage you got of happy animals too, thriving naturally in their natural environments in the wild, especially that, and they show the various traits that are so similar to humans, like the chimps who make spears, the bonobos who use sticks to check the depth of the water, the way elephants move in families and care for one another and protect each other, the way crows are so smart and they like to have fun, just like us, and the way that prairie dogs, this was a new one, I had no idea, how prairie dogs have their own language, prairie dog language, including grammar, including, I don't know, pronouns, sort of. Am I wrong in that? But can you please say a little bit more about whichever of those sort of, it's all fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, I even was blown away. I thought I was fairly familiar with this stuff, and some of what I learned really just stopped me in my tracks and made me say, wow, like, these are individuals experiencing the world. Like, humans are not the only individuals experiencing the world. In fact, we're a tiny minority of the individuals experiencing life. Almost everyone in the world is not human. And as you mentioned, examples like the play is particularly, I think, poignant. Crows and ravens who slide in the snow just for fun because they enjoy it. They're not doing it for us. They're not doing it for anything other than their own enjoyment. And they play together and literally slide around in the snow, like humans like to do. Female chimpanzees play with dolls. They essentially use rocks or sticks as if they're babies. So they'll, carry them around on their backs or cradle them as if they are pretending that this is a chimpanzee infant, just like human girls do all over the world. And that evolutionarily makes sense because that's practice for what they'll need to do as adults. So some of these things, I mean, the fact that they really show an inner life, that they show, for example, that someone appears to be able to engage in pretending that something is something else, just all of a sudden decenters us in this really profound way that I think just is one of the things that I think animal advocates have not tapped into as much when thinking about how to wake people up to rethinking their attitudes towards non-human animals. That there are so many things that we can see and recognize ourselves in. And it blurs that distinction, that sharp line that we were talking about earlier, the species distinction of there's us and then there's everything else that either exists for us or isn't really experiencing much. Whereas in fact, as I said, most individuals in the world are not human. And the evidence is very strong that many of them are having experiences just as strong and just as real to them as ours are to us.
Absolutely. They are having lives all their own, and we don't understand that completely. But it's fascinating when we get a little bit of a glimpse, into that. It's just so these are their superpowers. It's just so amazing. So in addition to the animals, I was struck by how many people who I admire and people who I'm sure you probably do as well admire, really leaders and icons of the animal liberation movement. Just the old school folks and new folks who are voices for the animals in this movement. So what was it like? What stands out to you about the people that you met, like Jane Goodall and Peter Singer and others? What stands out about you and about the experts you met?
The two examples you just provided, Jane Goodall and Peter Singer, particularly stand out to me. I was thinking of Ingrid Newkirk because she introduced the film in Philadelphia, where I think is where
I was there.
And so and she has a small cameo in terms of an image of her doing a protest in the film, even though she isn't interviewed in it. But all of these people and others like Richard Wrangham and Steven Pinker, who are in other fields, and Michael Shermer, Coleman Hughes, real intellectual influences in all of these different fields. The fact that people who are committed to rationality, who are committed to thinking about what we ought to do as clearly as they can, from all different backgrounds, are converging more and more, I think, on the notion that there's this big mistake, for lack of a better phrase, that humankind has been making for a big part of its history, where we've been drawing this fairly arbitrary distinction between ourselves and all of these other species. So people like, for example, Steven Pinker, who's, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, one of the most influential public intellectuals of our time, whose book, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, had a huge impact on me. That was one of his big Pulitzer Prize finalists. People like that who have this influence and are really at the top of moving the intellectual world. The fact that more and more of those people are seeing how we view non-human animals as a deeply important issue. I think those are really grounds for optimism about the long-term shift in humankind being led by the people who are the most forward-thinking very often.
Absolutely. So yeah, there's so much there. I bet you had a lot of footage you couldn't fit into that documentary of all your interviews because you had to leave some on the cutting room floor, kind of, so to speak. And boy, I would love to see, or maybe some bloopers. Maybe you can share. As I would love to see all that.
I do actually want to have some. I've been meaning to do some outtakes that I have that might be interesting to people that I could post on social media.
I would find it interesting personally. I don't know if anyone else would. I think they would. I think they would.
And some of them are funny.
Yeah, winds up being that. I'm going to ask you just like a couple more questions, and then I'm going to throw it over to our viewers, see what questions they have, so our viewers can begin thinking about your questions that you can put into the comment section. One thing, another sad image in the documentary was seeing the elephants with their legs chained in Thailand. Not to bring everybody down again, but I'm hoping maybe you're going to tell me something good, but that was really heartbreaking and angering. Anything we can do? Any call to action? I know we're so far from Thailand, but can you talk about that?
There is a lot of advocacy to persuade more tourists to not engage in elephant rides or elephant shows, and instead to support real elephant sanctuaries. A lot of places now pretend to be elephant sanctuaries, but they're not. The major foundation that has done some of the really valuable educational work here is called, there in Thailand, is called Save Elephant Foundation. And the sanctuary that they have in Thailand is called Elephant Nature Park. And the founder of that is one of the people I interview in the film when I'm there in Thailand, Lek Chilert. And so if you or people you know are going to Thailand, a friend of mine is actually there right now, just coincidentally, and is just blown away by it, and specifically is planning to visit the Elephant Nature Park and support the Save Elephant Foundation. So that's one of the best things to do. Educate, if you go yourself, or educating others, and then, if you're interested, sharing that information through the Save Elephant Foundations and Elephant Nature Park's social media, and supporting them. I should mention, though, that most of the animals whom we use, of course, are animals on factory farms. And we shouldn't forget that if every individual matters as much as every other individual, that we have to think about, make sure we're thinking about them, and we're not looking at what at the outset, is more moving to us. So for example, if every one of these individuals matters, those several thousand elephants in Thailand each matter just as much as any other animal. But then we have billions, literally tens of billions of chickens in the world who are in factory farms. And that's a number that's almost impossible to fathom. But, if a billion is 1,000 million, and we have tens of billions, and every one of those individuals matters as much as any, even of the large charismatic animals, then I think that gives us good grounds, especially because those are the animals people care about the least, to make sure that we include in our advocacy attention to those animals who are people care about the least and who are suffering in the greatest numbers. And that, in terms of animals raised for food, of course, includes chickens, but also aquatic animals, as is discussed in the film. That's something that we really profoundly overlook, again, because they're harder for us to empathize with. But, for example, fish, the evidence is continuing to come in that they have real emotional lives and sentience. And so some of the organizations doing the most for all of those individuals include those shown in the film, like Animal Equality and the Humane League and Mercy for Animals and People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals and so on.
Thanks for those reminders that there are things we can do right away in terms of boycotting, avoiding, and spreading awareness right now. So last question for the moment, but let's see if there's other questions in the chat. Change the subject here. In the documentary, you unpack the comparison between human slavery and you interview scholars who offer compelling explanations as to why we enslave animals. And you bring home the point that sometimes people think is a bit controversial, though, that human slavery was a moral blind spot in history, and that we are now living in a time of animal slavery, but we just don't see it. Just like they didn't see it then, we don't see it now. So can you comment on that, or what response that has gotten? And I think it also goes back to the chain of being, which I hadn't heard of.
Right. I think the example of human slavery being sort of ubiquitous throughout much of human history, throughout much of the world, that's a very powerful reminder of the extent to which people are capable of having massive moral blind spots that in hindsight seem so gaping and obvious. And so looking back throughout history at that and at many other forms of prejudice and abuses of groups of individuals, that should humble us and make us realize that we should not be too confident that today's status quo is the morally enlightened thing, because that's what people thought back then when they had those blind spots. And of course, the blind spot of speciesism seems to be just as real, and the consequences, of course, detrimental to non-human animals, being a grave understatement.
Absolutely. It's good putting it in that perspective. Then it seems less, doesn't point the finger. It just says this is a human blind spot that we all tend to have. And there's many of them. Maybe we have blind spots that are so blind we don't even know we have them yet. We may be unaware of them. And of course, in many small ways and large ways. So a question in the chat is, what has the response been like from the film overall? Any pushback? Anything cool that you can report?
Yeah, I've been really amazed with the response. I was cautiously optimistic. I thought the film came out well, but so many people have been telling me that it's their new go-to introduction to share with people. Like, that my real ultimate aim for this film would to make something that animal advocates can hold as one package and be able to give or watch with friends and family members and others, and have it be something that those people are really interested in seeing. Something where if you look at the trailer, for example, on the website humansandotheranimalsmovie.com, you'll see like it's designed to be entertaining and engaging and curiosity inducing and dramatic and make people say, wow, this is interesting. I want to check it out. And that is what allows you to say, oh, check this out. This was a great movie. And it was about some of the topics we talked about. And, you know, if they ask, you can tell them it's not graphic or anything like that. And, you know, I want to hear what you think or watch it with them. And I hope that that this is a new tool that people will find really opens the door for these conversations with friends and family members, gets them to take the issue more seriously, and gets them to take the first steps toward making changes themselves.
So we have a question from our friend Tamara. Mark, can you describe the difficulties you experienced in distributing the film? How likely is it that the film will hit theaters?
The film is not aimed at theaters. It's just aimed at streaming because that's where it'll reach the most people. So we did theatrical premieres. So we did limited theater screenings, you know, in New York City, in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, Philadelphia, and Boston. But the main aim was to get it out as soon as possible on these streaming platforms. So it's on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, Google Play. You'll see them all if you go to the website humansandotheranimalsmovie.com and you click on watch the movie, you'll see all the places to watch it. So it's now already available in many different territories all over the United States and in the UK, and it'll soon be available in many other parts of the world soon. Canada, Mexico, Brazil, throughout other parts of Europe, and so on.
Nice. Maybe we have some budding documentarians with us. Another question is, how are the documentaries funded?
So a few ways. Some people actually who were fans of the previous film, who are donors to animal advocacy, wanted to support my next project, and so donated to this one. I also used some of my own savings and funds from from the first movie, Speciesism, from what that was able to take in to now, put into the next project.
Nice. Where there's a will, there's a way. We make it happen. So
Yeah, it
this
is funny that a lot of people, when you look at it and how many places I went to and all the different investigative things, people think it was this huge budget movie. But, we were able to do it on a
A
fairly
shoestring.
tight budget.
Great, great. So maybe you got to do a training, a workshop on that.
Mhm.
Create your documentary on a little tiny budget and get it done and do it well. So
Well, I also had a fantastic crew. I mean, really,
yeah.
this was all a really good professional crew, who, worked for less than they would normally because they're animal advocates and supportive. A great, color correctionist who's done, sound and color for, the big companies like Disney and so forth, and helped with this for a low price and so on. So like, a lot of that's another example of when we talk about animal advocates using their skills. I mean, all of these people who are supportive of helping the world take non-human animals more seriously by giving their talent to this film at rates that my company could afford, when they were very talented people, allowed me to do much more and make the film much better and more powerful.
There are good people in the world and they come forward for the animals. Truly, it's part of their service, so an extension of how they're serving, and I'm sure they see it as helping the cause in the long term.
And they very much are. Yeah. Yeah.
And there's truth in that, right? Immediately, automatically. That's why we say in this movement, knowing so many people growing this movie, everybody's got talents and everybody's got skills. And this is where it really shows up when we can really harness and capitalize on everybody's different skills and coming together.
There's actually a Slack channel, incidentally, called Hive. Have you heard of it? I mean, one of the things it has is a Slack channel, and it's you might want to be associated, get in touch with them and so forth, and some of your viewers and so forth, because there's a lot of overlap between what you're doing and some of what they're doing, which is essentially connecting people with different skills.
Excellent. Thank you. I hope someone will put that into the chat
Yeah,
for
but
us.
if not, you can look it up, like Hive animal advocacy,
Okay.
or like, yeah.
So another question, what are your thoughts on an abolitionism versus welfareism view? Some protests or orgs call for better welfare, but it feels inauthentic for me to be advocating for bigger cages rather than no cages. I know this is an ongoing discussion in our movement.
Right. That's a huge subject. And I try in the film to introduce the case against speciesism and the case against animal exploitation, and then introduce the people holding those different views without the film itself taking a view on it, so that it can be used as an introduction by everyone. So, for example, it has the people who are most involved in some of the big animal welfare campaigns, and it also has Gary Francione in the movie, who is, of course, one of the main people who is associated with the abolitionist view, if not sort of like a person who essentially coined that. And Francione is in both this movie and my previous movie. And of course, speaks very powerfully about the issue of the property status of non-human animals. So there's this obviously is such a huge topic that's had so much discussion between animal advocates that is very sophisticated, that there's no way I can give a satisfactory answer or even summary. But I can say that I am very glad that people on all sides of that discussion, people who take what is referred to as the abolitionist view, and people who also think that we should engage in reforms for the animals who are suffering now in the factory farms and so on, that all of those people have said to me, people from all of those different persuasions have said to me that they really loved the film and that they found the film something valuable that they'll use to introduce the movement and so forth. So it's gotten a really positive response across that spectrum of people who disagree on tactics and so on. And I think as a movement, it's very valuable to have ongoing discussions about tactics and strategies and principles, and to focus and collectively use the things, the information and the tools that we can agree on and can share. And that's what I've hoped to do with this film, to really represent the existence of those views, and to have something that they all have in common that they can both use or all use as this introduction to the movement.
Yeah, I like that. You're presenting all different views. The movie itself doesn't take a stance, but it's giving people an opportunity to make up their own mind, and maybe offers that there's room for both in the meantime while we're trying to achieve animal liberation, reducing suffering at the same time, and one doesn't have to negate necessarily the other. So we're definitely open to some more additional questions. We have a little more time that we can spend exploring the documentary with documentarian Mark DeVries, who is here with us tonight
I'll
live.
mention, yeah, I can mention another interesting thing that, I think one of the ways in which people like the way in which uh introductions like this seem to be valuable is that there are so many questions that people have and objections that people have to the basics. So it's like when you introduce someone to the case for eating plant-based foods and against factory farming and so on, there are a lot of things that you know that they will ask. And so it's almost like we go through this whole process of there are all these different things. So what about, this and what about that and so forth. And to be able to sort of get past a lot of that by having a film that answers all the things that they'll ask so that you're essentially then on the same page and and able to have these more nuanced discussions and so forth, rather than having to sort of like re-explain the wheel with all of your advocacy with people you know. I think from an animal advocacy standpoint, no matter where we stand on specifics about tactics and so forth, having something where we can really say, okay, this is all of the basics. This is the case against speciesism. This is what's happening to animals. This is the case for our own personal choices being different and so on. That gives us that one package that then moves things ahead much farther and faster with the people we're speaking with.
Excellent. So another question, what made you decide to make movies in the first place? Do you have a film background? I think you have an other background, but
no, I'm actually a lawyer by background, but
okay. Not too much of a leap there from lawyer to filmmaker.
It's strange. There's actually a surprisingly large overlap. Like I've heard of a lot of lawyers who are documentary filmmakers specifically, and I'm not 100% sure why. But anyway, the first film came out. The first film I first, before I had any idea of doing film stuff, I came across the topic of factory farming and speciesism and so on, and specifically factory farming. And I started looking into it. And then it occurred to me while I was watching a documentary about something else that this is a topic that could really use a documentary that's in the style of like a person whom you're following, going out and learning about these things and so on. So it just gave me the idea that at the time, back when I was, before the first film came out, this was in the early 2000s. And so there really wasn't much in terms of documentaries about this subject. And so it really hit me. And I said, well, I don't know how to make a documentary, but I'm just going to try to learn how to use the equipment and find some people who can help me make a documentary and so forth. And then I went out and started doing it and, learned as I went. And then that was that first documentary, Speciesism. That's another reason why I thought making this new documentary, Humans and Other Animals, was valuable because although I'm glad that Speciesism had the reaction that it did, it was low production value, as they call it, right? It was the lighting and the sound and everything. It was an amateur project. It was made without any professional crew or anything. So having something that now uses all the filmmaking principles and filmmaking talent and so forth and introduces the animal movement in one package like that, I think it really was the next step. So it was almost in part precisely because I didn't have a film background that this new film exists.
That's great. Yeah. So a lawyer is commenting, another lawyer, we lawyers need to be persuasive storytellers on film and in the courtroom. So
I think that is part of it, actually. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That like I was not totally serious in saying I don't really know why. I think that law, especially if it's trial law, but even if you're writing motions and so forth, you're putting together both a story and you're putting together things in a logical sequence and thinking about how it will come across when presented to others. I mean, it's, persuasion in both cases is a big factor. So I think that's probably right, that's a very substantial factor.
Yeah, and as I'm thinking about it now, knowing that you were looking at it through a lawyer's lens, to some degree because you can't help it because that's just part of who you are. Even though it's a hat that you wear and you took off maybe to do the documentary, but I can still see where, being very detail oriented in the movie and proving your points and evidence and statistically based, reality based, presenting it from that lens, not just opinion, but facts, right? I could see where that was coming through.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it goes both ways in the sense that like some of those personality traits and so forth, and that the motivation to do things in that way would be what would also make me interested in law. So, they kind of go together. But yeah, and that's definitely, it seems to be a relationship there, not just between the filmmaking itself, but between the style of filmmaking that I'd have and the interest in law and science, which
Yeah.
is different. It's interesting that the relationship with law, you're starting with your conclusion and essentially, and, trying to produce arguments for it. Science is using reason, but trying to test your conclusion. So I'm, in terms of like how we should interact with the world, and in some sense, I'm, try to be more like a scientist than a lawyer. And that's what I hope I try to inspire with this film, trying to be open-minded and trying to follow the arguments where they lead you, rather than and trying to leave your initial assumptions to put them to the side and follow the facts and the logic where they go.
And what was it called? There's a name for it when you lay out almost like a mathematical lay out your arguments in philosophy or in ethics.
Well, I mean,
remember how you lay that out? Like hurting is bad, like equals hurting is bad.
Right. I mean, I talked about it in the film as just being an argument. And so like the use of argument in the sort of the formal definition in law or in philosophy and so forth involves having premises that logically lead to a conclusion, at least in the case of deductive arguments. But then in terms of like the specific form of argument, I don't talk about it in the film, but of course the different forms of arguments have names like modus ponens and modus tollens and so forth. And that is very helpful. One of the main things that I show on the screen is a modus ponens, I believe, and so on. So there's definitely like the more you become familiar with the formality of logical reasoning, that definitely helps with clear thinking, as long as it's combined with being motivated towards truth seeking. So not using using logic just to try to defend or support the conclusions that you already have, but to be able to say, okay, what would I think about this argument or this piece of evidence if the conclusion were the opposite of what I wanted to believe or the opposite of what I currently believe? And so using those sorts of principles, something that's been referred to by the writer Julia Galef as the scout mindset in her actually really wonderful book called The Scout Mindset, all about how to practice following reason and evidence where it leads rather than just defending existing views. And I think for everyone, animal advocates and others, having a scout mindset is quite valuable. The other thing, by the way, that is valuable, I think, to all animal advocates and to all people who are interested in social and political change is to make sure that we have as realistic and honest as possible of an understanding of human nature. Humans are animals, and we have a complex nature. And that includes motives to do good things and motives to do harmful things. And we, with a deeper understanding of our nature and our tendencies, can push at an individual level and at a social norms level ourselves and human beings in general away from motives to do bad things or harmful things and towards motives to do good things, cooperative things, and helpful things. But understanding that we're not blank slates and that we're not inherently just good. We're not angels who've been corrupted. We're already to some degree, quote, corrupt in terms of the deep evolutionary roots of our behavior that gives us competitive and harmful motives as well as cooperative and helpful motives. Not that competition is always bad, but that's a different topic. And one of my favorite books that had the biggest influence on me, and which is why I interviewed the author in the film, as I mentioned, is The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature by Steven Pinker. So if you're already an animal advocate who is already familiar with, you've already seen this film and you're already, using it to share with friends and family, and you're already familiar with Peter Singer's Animal Liberation Now and so forth, and you're thinking about what work might be valuable for improving how you think about these issues, outside of after all that basic stuff about the animal issues, The Blank Slate is a really valuable source, I think, of improving how we think of ourselves and our species, so that we can try to be maximally realistic and maximally impactful when making social change.
Nice. So we got a couple more questions and we'll wrap up kind of shortly. And someone is asking, do you offer legal services for animal activists?
I don't practice as a lawyer now, so not in a really significant capacity, and my field is not something that would be related to many of animal advocates' specific interests, whether it's like trespass law or First Amendment law and so forth. All of that requires specific expertise in that specific area. That being said, there are lawyers who that you can look up in some of these networks that we talked about that are animal advocates and are interested in helping animal advocates who are dealing with or interested in learning about specific issues that might affect them, whether it's in the case of their advocacy or in the case of animal law. Obviously, that's a whole field of its own.
Mm-hmm. And do your non-vegan friends and family watch? Have you introduced them to your documentaries? Do they watch? How does that go? And I guess any advice as we want to introduce the documentary to our friends and family, what we might say, again, how we might present it to them?
That's a great question. Yes, I think this film has been really valuable. I've heard from people I know who have already changed their diets as a result of this film, including not even people I know well. I mean, some I do, some I don't, and so forth. And I think that speaks to the palatability of it. Again, I really tried to make something that someone would be interested in seeing and curious about, and that they'll keep watching because it's not upsetting or finger pointing or anything like that. So if you look at, for example, the trailer and the description of the film on its website, humansandotheraanimalsmovie.com, you'll see that it's aimed to be, curiosity inducing and make you interested in like the drama of the investigations and in the cutting edge science of what happens to animals, or of the capacities of non-human animals. On the film's website, there's one of the buttons on the menu bar is called Share the Movie. And it has a very brief description of how I would suggest introducing it to friends and family members. And it's something like, essentially, there's this really cool movie that I saw that was really thought-provoking about the inner lives of animals and about some of the things we've talked about. Presumably you've talked about some issues involving animals with them. I'd really like to hear what you think. Some things like that. And it's like a fun movie about this guy who goes around and finds out how similar animals are, and then goes off on these crazy investigations. Like, wow, you really have to see it. Let's say, assuming you feel that way about it. That would be things like that. And then even being willing to watch it with them. Things like that can really get people to say, okay, I should check this out, and then ask them, hey, did you see the movie yet that I was telling you about, and so forth. And then, of course, on the film's website, on the share the movie page of it, you'll also see links to where to share it on social media, and there are like pre-written little descriptions of the movie that I've found are compelling for Facebook and Twitter, for example, where it has a pre-written tweet or a pre-written Facebook post that obviously you can edit that has some of the powerful ways to spread the word about it on social media. And that's powerful as well, and obviously it also includes linking people to the website.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for all that. You almost created a template for us and made it easy to share.
That's exactly right.
That's fantastic. So I think this will be the final question of the evening from me, which is overall at the end of the documentary. By the end of the documentary, I felt like you left viewers with a hopeful message, that it was hopeful in the end. That the way I remember it is that we are potentially on the verge of a major paradigm shift and in our awareness and in our way that we see the world. In other words, what's available if we can start seeing animals, seeing that we're animals, and seeing animals as the same as us, as one, or all of us earthlings, that there's something gigantic, something huge available on the other side of that. Is that sort of how you might summarize the hopefulness in the message?
Yeah, I think it's easy to feel when you look at the scale of what's happening and the extent to which right now humankind seems to have little interest in it. It can be difficult. And a lot of animal advocates, of course, find it very difficult to be aware of the scale and the gravity of the apparent wrongs. And so it's very important to remind ourselves that changes like the one that animal advocates are seeking have happened over and over again throughout history. That, for instance, human slavery existed for thousands of years, and in a relatively short time, there was a dramatic switch to changing attitudes and abolishing overt legal slavery. And that it seems to me, every reason to think that, considering the strength of these arguments and considering the surprisingly rapid growth in serious discussion about these issues, there's more and more now in major publications, serious discussions about the idea of speciesism, the idea of whether we're justified to use animals, debates about this, and so on. Like, we're really seeing a change that even just a decade ago, we couldn't have, I think many of us wouldn't have thought was possible to have even the extent of discussion that there is now and the extent of the seriousness. And there's no reason to think that that's slowing down. So we should look at the long arc of history and recognize that humankind has morally excluded and exploited animals for a very long time, and that the fact that there's such a rapid shift in just a matter of decades is grounds for real hope that that shift will continue. And everyone who is part of that, I think, should be very proud and recognize that they're doing something deeply meaningful, that they're part of a great and almost inconceivably important change in the history of our species and the world. And I hope for those who are watching, I hope that this film will be another part of their tools that they have to help move these things forward.
Wow, thank you. That really is a hopeful message and a beautiful point to end on, and reminding ourselves that we all make a difference. When we get overwhelmed, we have to remember that we may not see it all happen tomorrow, but I like that when you zoom out and look at the arc of history, like you're saying, we're heading in the right direction. We're heading in the right direction. So Mark, thank you so much for all that you shared. I want to wrap up by saying, please consider becoming a patron by finding AAM on Patreon. Your donations allow AAM to continue to provide free educational resources for activists, which ultimately saves more animals. And thank you, Mark, for taking on this topic so effectively and genuinely in your documentary. I hope that everyone, if you haven't seen it yet, again, it is streaming right now on Amazon Prime and Apple TV and Google Play, and go to the website as well to share it. And thank you all for being here and the tireless work that you're doing for the animals. If you're interested in becoming a mentor or mentee, or want to get involved with AAM, please reach out to us, animalactivismmentorship.com. Until next time, everyone, stay strong, get active, and live vegan. AAM signing off. Bye, y'all.